Welcome back. So now before we get started with coding, let's just talk a little bit about the architecture that we're going to choose for my application right here. I'm only talking about the backend right now. I'm not talking about the front end yet. The front end is going to be something completely different where we're going to talk about how we can handle and work with the backend that we're going to build in the next lessons. So I'm going to show you guys just first of all a link right here under documents on Microsoft.com and under application and under modern ASP.NET web application ebook. And if you go down to the common web application architecture right here, there's a small read right here, 20 minutes, and it's pretty nice to read. It's about the different architectures that are kind of out there that most people use for the web applications if they build them from scratch, right? And let's have a look at one of them that I've seen actually a lot of companies use and that I don't feel is that strong when we kind of dive into bigger systems with more developers. And it's the one solution for everything, right? This is a very, very simple application, a monolith sample is what they call it. It's one project containing both a web API and everything you need to kind of build a full backend. So you have both services in here, you have some models in here, you have some data infrastructure in here, how to kind of get data. You have some controllers to send some data or some HTML to a user who's sitting on the other side. So everything is in one big solution. This might seem nice because it's very easy to kind of navigate everything, but the problem is when you start having bigger teams, it might start creating some bottlenecks where people start committing the same code, people start changing the same files, you don't really have responsibility, the folders start growing, the entire build starts growing. It's just not a good solution when we start having bigger applications. Small, very limited applications might use this, and some companies will even say this is the right way to go. Some will say this is definitely not the right way to go, but I would say, well, let's try and be smarter than this at least in our system. So let's zoom out a bit. Scrolling further down, there's a talk about what layers are all about, and I think most of you already know what layers are, but look at this. This is the n-layer architecture where we normally talk about the tree-layer architecture. Very briefly, what is that all about? Well, it's about communication in the architecture where we put at least a bit more responsibility to different projects. So we have a project to take care of user interface, a project to take care of the logic of our application, the business logic, and a project to take care of the infrastructure or the data access in our project. Now and then we have a bit more projects for entities and stuff like that. But this is what we call the tree-layered architecture, and it's probably one of the ones that most people have learned about throughout the history. Let's scroll further down just to talk a little bit about this. I'll zoom a little bit again, and here's how that would look. You would now have 3 different projects instead of a single one. Definitely helpful. It makes it easier for us to develop when we start growing. We start having we know that when we want to talk about changing the REST API, or in this case the web page, we only have to kind of manipulate this area right here. When we want to talk about changing the business logic, it's this area, and when we want to change anything within the data source of any kind, we're going to talk about this area right here. So it's easier for us now to know where to go as developers in this setup. And also we have builds that we can only build this area or this area. We don't have to build everything every time. So there's a lot of improvement. It's easier to kind of split up the code and say, well, you're the UI guy, you take care of this area. I am kind of the business logic guy, I'll take care of this. And we have a database guy who knows everything about SQL. He can take care of this area. So we start getting a bit more architecture into the system, but there are still some issues. Like it's often very hard for us to make sure that people don't start using different context things up here directly and kind of bind themselves between the application core and the infrastructure. And also the same problem now and then with web, where we kind of bind ourselves to the infrastructure or whatever we kind of bind ourselves to. So we still have a binding issue where things still are very tightly coupled, and we want to get even further away from that. And that's where Microsoft actually moved to the next step, which is the clean architecture. Now the clean architecture, there are a couple of ways to do that. One is the onion architecture, and this is from Jeffrey Palermo. You can go and check out this site if you want to. And the other one that I found is the hexagonal architecture, which is again an idea with where we have ports and adapters, and I like that one. I like that a lot actually, so I kind of tried to bind these two together to make a new architecture. I'm not going to name it because if people like it, they can probably find a name for it. But it's a way for me to kind of make it even easier to hopefully explain to you what the different areas does for you, and again to explain the responsibility in the different areas and why it makes sense to have these areas. Let's scroll down and have a look at this clean architecture, and this is the simple view right here. We have an area, the center of the application is pretty much the domain services, the application core, and the domain services and the interfaces and entities are in the center of our application. So this is kind of stuff you would never change. This is the stuff that's the business cases for the application for the company, right? We might change the user interface later. We might change it from being a REST API to being a web application. We might change it to be a mobile app. We might change it to be, I don't know, anything. The front end might change, but it will still remain and stay and use the same core, the same business logic. The same with the infrastructure. We might save data differently later. We might add ways to kind of send emails. We might use Chipmunk first, and then we might change to a Microsoft service or something like that to send emails. So this might change as well, but this will remain the same for the entire life cycle of the application. That's the goal, at least. And this is also what we'll start out by testing to make sure that this is completely tested as well. So let's scroll down and see the difference. Right here, you'll notice this is the clean architecture, and it seems the same. We have the user interface, we have the application core, and we have the infrastructure. And again, if you look at the tree layered, that's kind of the same thing. We have the user interface, the business logic, and the data access layer, so they're kind of the same. What's the difference? The main difference is, again, remember here we kind of had a relation down here, and we kind of had a binding, down here. So they knew about each other like this. User interface to business logic to data access, right? So they were bound together like this. Now here's the difference. We're going to change that now. We're going to try and say instead, since the business logic is like the center of the application, that it can't know anything about what's in here and what's in here. This is the guy that needs to be clean. He needs to be unaware of everybody else. Okay? Let's scroll down and see how we do that. We say the application core is now the bottom of our application. That's the guy who can't know about anybody. So notice there are no arrows from the application upwards. He doesn't know about anybody, right? The testing we're going to do knows about the application core. So we go downwards. The user interface knows about the application core, and the infrastructure knows about the application core. And then the user interface knows a little bit about the infrastructure to kind of do some binding, and again, we'll talk about that later. So we kind of made this guy the center of the world in this application right here. I'll show you how we'll do this, because there's not, in my mind, too many examples out there that actually try to explain how to code it. There's just a lot of theory about how to use it. So let's just end it right here. Now you know the architecture, which is going to be this clean architecture right here with a few things from Hexagonal and a few things from the Onion architecture. And that combined, I'm going to show you my architecture in the next lesson. See you next time. Have fun.